In the quiet, sun-soaked town of Rosedale, Texas, where the slow hum of daily life often felt like a lullaby, a nightmare was about to unfold. Rosedale, a small city nestled just outside the larger metropolis of Houston, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. People lived in close-knit communities, and most of the time, the biggest stories revolved around school football games or local fundraisers. But on this fateful afternoon, the peace of the town would be shattered. Sergeant Helen Devereaux, a woman whose steely gaze and reputation for getting things done had earned her the respect of her colleagues, stood motionless on the edge of her driveway. Her sharp, ice-blue eyes narrowed, watching the sunlight flicker off the patrol car parked across the street. It was a strange sight for someone as familiar with the town as Helen was. It wasn't often that police cruisers were called out to her neighborhood. But as she stared at the car, something inside her twisted. Helen's father, a man named Bernard Devereaux, was not a perfect man. No one was, of course. But to Helen, he had always been a complicated figure, both a protector and a source of deep-seated resentment. She had grown up watching him navigate the world with a hard edge, one that sometimes made her feel small, unimportant. As a cop, she had seen it all. People making mistakes, slipping into lives of crime, hurting others. But Helen had never been prepared for the darkness lurking inside her own home. Lily, her daughter, had known her grandfather as a loving figure, someone who'd taken part in her childhood, a person she could rely on. But Lily's life hadn't been easy, and it had begun long before the incident that would alter everything. Her biological father had been a man who never truly fit into the picture of family life. He left when Lily was just a baby, the hole he left in her life never quite filled. Helen had been forced to take on both roles, the mother and the father. She did it out of love, but it wasn't easy. Being a single parent in law enforcement meant long, unpredictable hours. Helen was often called out to crime scenes or had to work overtime, leaving Lily to grow up mostly alone. The little time they had together was often strained by Helen's fatigue, and the tension between trying to raise a child and keep the town safe was something no one could prepare her for. And now, as the world outside her home carried on, Helen felt the weight of all those years where she had tried to balance it all, only to fall short. Her daughter's silence in recent weeks hadn't gone unnoticed, but between work and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Helen hadn't seen it as a red flag. That was the mistake. The front door creaked open and Helen stepped inside the house, her boots clacking against the hardwood floors. There was an eerie silence in the air, almost as if the house itself were holding its breath. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning running in the background, but even that felt distant, far away. "Lily?" Helen called, her voice betraying the slightest hint of concern. She didn't hear the usual response of her daughter, the sound of running footsteps, or the soft chatter that filled their home when Lily was around. She frowned and headed toward the stairs. As she reached the landing, Helen froze. The door to her daughter's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling from the gap. It was then that a strange, unexplainable feeling gripped her chest, a feeling of impending doom. She hadn't expected to find anything unusual, but what she would find would change her life forever. Before we dive deeper into the heart of the story, if you're enjoying the unfolding drama, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more riveting content and the full continuation of this story. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Lily's room was neatly organized, the way it always had been. But as Helen stepped closer, something caught her eye, a shadow at the far end of the room. It was hard to make out at first, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she saw him. Bernard, her father. He was standing there in the corner of the room, and his face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. Helen's heart dropped to her stomach, and the blood drained from her face as she saw her daughter sitting on the bed, her hands clasped tightly together. Lily's face was contorted with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. And then it hit Helen like a punch to the gut. Bernard wasn't just standing there. He was doing something that no father, no man should ever do. And as the realization washed over her, everything in Helen's world fractured. The life she had built, the trust she had in her own flesh and blood, shattered in an instant. Her father, the man she had known for all her life, had crossed a line so far beyond forgiveness that she could hardly breathe. Helen didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in shock. Time seemed to stop, the world outside her home no longer mattered. All that existed was the terror before her, the darkness that had festered in the place she had once called safe. She felt numb, but in that numbness was also a rage she couldn't comprehend. It rose within her like a storm, threatening to break free. And then she moved. Quietly at first, her legs trembling beneath her, but then with a purpose. She turned away from the doorway and walked toward the living room. In the corner of the room, next to a family portrait, was the gun she had kept for years, a weapon that was always nearby, tucked into her holster when she went to work. She took it in her hand, the cold metal oddly grounding her in the chaos. The decision she was about to make would define her forever, but she was past the point of reason. She couldn't think, she couldn't process, she just reacted. Helen's grip on the gun tightened. The cold steel felt foreign in her hands, but the weight of it was something she had known well. As a seasoned cop, she had trained for moments like this, though never had she imagined it would be her own family that would bring her to this breaking point. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle as her mind raced. The quiet of the house was deafening now, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway filling the void. She didn't hear her own footsteps as she moved through the living room, but every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop. She knew what she was about to do, she had known for a long time that it was a possibility. But this wasn't something any law enforcement officer could ever fully prepare for. As Helen moved closer to the stairs, she heard the faint rustle of clothing. It was Bernard, shifting in place, no doubt aware that she had entered the room. He was probably wondering why she wasn't screaming at him, why she hadn't already called the police. But Helen wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Helen's mind was filled with images of her daughter, her beautiful, innocent Lily, sitting there with her hands clasped tightly, her face frozen in terror. Bernard, the man who had been her protector for so long, was now a monster in her eyes. He was a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. All the years of training, all the years of serving as an officer, seemed to have melted away in that moment. Her father had destroyed everything she had believed in. He had violated a trust so sacred, so pure, that there could be no coming back from it. In that moment, Helen could no longer differentiate between what was right and what was wrong. She had spent her entire life upholding the law, ensuring that justice was served. But this was different. This wasn't a case she could bring to the courts. This wasn't something she could fix with an arrest. Her breath caught as she heard the soft shuffle of feet behind her. Bernard was moving toward her, and Helen knew that the moment had come. She turned around, her eyes locking onto his. There was no recognition, no sign of remorse in his expression. Just an almost eerie calmness, as though nothing was wrong, as though the chaos that had just unfolded had no bearing on him. But it did. It did for Helen. And as she stared into his eyes, she saw a man who had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. A man who had taken advantage of the very thing he had sworn to protect. Helen couldn't speak. She couldn't find the words to ask him why. Why had he done this? Why had he ruined everything? But it didn't matter. There was no answer that would ever make sense to her. Slowly, Bernard raised his hands, a gesture of surrender, but it didn't matter. He didn't understand the weight of his actions. He didn't understand the depth of the pain he had caused, not just to his granddaughter, but to his daughter. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The room was heavy with silence, and Helen felt the tension in her chest growing tighter, like the walls were closing in on her. Her finger hovered over the trigger, and for a fleeting moment she felt like an observer in her own life, as though everything was happening to someone else. But the reality was inescapable. She couldn't walk away from this. She couldn't turn her back on what had happened. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but her hands shook violently. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears as her mind replayed the images of Lily's terrified face. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't let him hurt anyone else. Not now, not ever. With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, she squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, and for a brief moment Helen's entire world froze. The force of the recoil sent a shockwave through her body, but she held firm, her finger still pressing against the trigger. The gunfire was deafening in the small house, but the quiet aftermath was even more suffocating. Helen's gaze never left her father as he stumbled back, his face twisting in shock. His hand reached toward his chest, but there was no time for him to do anything. She fired again, and again, and again. The sound of the gunshots seemed endless, and Helen didn't know how many times she pulled the trigger. She couldn't stop herself. Each shot felt like it was chipping away at the years of trust, of memories, of everything she had once known. When it was over, when the last shot had rung out, the room was still. Bernard was on the floor, a lifeless figure sprawled in the corner of Lily's room. His once strong hands were now limp, his eyes staring at nothing, his body slack and unmoving. Helen stood there, the gun still in her hand, the weight of what she had just done sinking in. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving as she looked at the body on the floor. She hadn't expected it to feel this way, Cold, distant, as though she were floating outside her own body, watching it all unfold from a place she couldn't reach. But then she heard it. Lily's soft sobs. Helen turned, her eyes instantly finding her daughter, who was still sitting on the bed. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her body shaking with fear and sorrow. Helen's heart broke as she met Lily's gaze. Her daughter had seen everything. She had witnessed the destruction of a family, the death of a man who had once been a part of their lives. Helen didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to explain what had happened, why she had done it. But the answer didn't matter now. The choice had been made. And the road ahead would be one they both had to walk, no matter how painful, no matter how difficult. Helen dropped to her knees beside Lily, pulling her into an embrace as the two of them cried together. It was a painful, gut-wrenching moment, but it was the only thing Helen could do. She couldn't take back what had happened, but she could still be there for her daughter. In the silence of that room, the weight of their new reality settled over them both. The hours that followed were a blur. Time moved in strange, disjointed moments, each one marked by the sound of sirens in the distance, the flashing red and blue lights that danced in the windows, and the quiet sobs of Lily, who hadn't stopped crying since the shooting. Helen could barely hear anything else above the pounding in her head. She was numb, every part of her body stiff with the weight of what she had just done. There was no escaping the reality of the situation. When the police arrived, it was as if they were a part of a dream, voices and faces that she couldn't fully grasp. Her colleagues, people who had trusted her for years, stood in the doorway, eyes wide with shock. They must have recognized the horror in her expression, the gun still in her hand, the blood that stained the carpet. They hadn't said anything at first, just looked at her in disbelief. Helen couldn't meet their eyes. She felt like a criminal, like a woman who had betrayed everything she had ever worked for. She had spent years enforcing the law, protecting the people of Rosedale. But now she was the one who had broken it. The sound of footsteps echoed in the house, and a voice called out her name, Lieutenant Carter. He had been with Helen through thick and thin, a steady presence in her career. But now even his voice sounded unfamiliar. There was no comfort in it, no reassurance that everything would be okay. There was only the cold, hard truth of the situation. "Helen," he said, his voice low, "put the gun down." She didn't move. Her fingers were still wrapped tightly around the handle of the weapon, the metal cold and unforgiving against her palm. She wanted to drop it, to let go, but somehow she couldn't. The weight of the decision, the weight of her actions, pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds of stone. "Helen," Lieutenant Carter repeated, his voice softer this time. "It's over. You need to let it go." The words didn't make sense. How could it be over? What had just happened? How could she have done this? She had shot her own father. Shot him 5 times. And for what? For Lily? For justice? Or for some twisted form of revenge? She didn't know. All she knew was that in the moments after the shooting she had felt something take over, something dark, something primal. And now, standing there with the gun in her hand and her father lying dead on the floor, she couldn't understand what it all meant. The police took the gun from her hands gently, but Helen barely noticed the action. Her body moved mechanically as they led her to a chair. She couldn't bring herself to look at the officers, not at first. She couldn't look at anyone. All she could see was Lily, still sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. Lily hadn't moved from that spot since the shooting. She hadn't spoken either. Her silence was deafening, as if she were trapped in a world of her own, one where nothing made sense anymore. Helen couldn't blame her. How could anyone make sense of something like this? A daughter watching her father be killed by her mother? The entire situation felt surreal, like a nightmare that refused to end. As the officers began their investigation, taking notes and collecting evidence, Helen remained in the chair, staring at the floor. Her thoughts were jumbled, her mind running in circles. She had spent so many years studying crime, understanding human behavior, trying to predict outcomes. But she had never expected this. She had never expected to be on the other side of the law, never imagined that she would be the one to create the kind of tragedy she had spent her life trying to prevent. The sounds of the police officers faded into the background as Helen's thoughts turned inward. She thought of Bernard, the man who had raised her, who had always been there, or so she had believed. But now all she could feel was a deep, gnawing emptiness. Her father's betrayal ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. And Lily, her daughter, who had been caught in the middle of this nightmare, would carry the weight of it for the rest of her life. Helen's eyes drifted back to her daughter, who was still silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. There was nothing Helen could say to undo what had been done, nothing that could change the horror of that moment. She had acted out of instinct, out of a mother's desire to protect her child. But in doing so, she had irrevocably altered the course of their lives. As the hours passed, Helen was taken into custody, though she was allowed to sit in the back of a squad car, staring out the window as the town of Rosedale slipped away in the distance. The familiar streets, the places she had walked 1,000 times, felt foreign now. They were no longer hers. And neither was the life she had once known. Inside the police station, Helen sat quietly, her head lowered as she waited for her attorney to arrive. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know what would happen next. But deep down she knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. Her life and Lily's had been changed forever. The investigation into Bernard's death would drag on for weeks, but the story was already spreading through Rosedale like wildfire. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers would weigh in on the tragedy. But for Helen, the pain was far deeper than what anyone outside her family could ever understand. She had lost her father in the worst way possible. She had lost the man who had once been a part of her identity. And she had to face the fact that the world would never see her the same way again. Her badge, her career, everything she had worked for, had been torn away in an instant. And then there was Lily. The bond between mother and daughter would be tested in ways Helen could never have imagined. The truth would haunt them both forever. They would both have to come to terms with the darkness that had seeped into their lives. And they would have to decide if they could ever heal from the scars that had been left behind. The road ahead was uncertain. But Helen knew one thing. It would be a long, painful journey. The days following Bernard's death were a blur. The weight of what had happened pressed down on Helen like a suffocating blanket, each breath a struggle. The media caught wind of the incident, turning Rosedale from a quiet, sleepy town into a circus of reporters and flashing cameras. The story spread across the country, filling news channels with salacious headlines and whispered rumors. A Texas cop, her father dead, a shattered family. The narrative seemed too surreal, too unbelievable for anyone to truly grasp. Helen's life as a law enforcement officer, the very thing that had defined her for years, crumbled. She was placed on administrative leave and eventually, the department launched a full investigation into the events that had unfolded in her home. Her colleagues, the very people she had once stood beside, now looked at her with a mixture of disbelief, judgment, and pity. They wanted answers, but none of the questions seemed to have clear, acceptable answers. The days felt like years. Helen's attorney advised her to remain silent, to wait for the investigation to run its course. But silence never offered her the peace she so desperately sought. It only made her more aware of the emptiness she felt in her heart. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's lifeless body on the floor. She saw Lily's tear-streaked face, her innocent eyes forever scarred by the sight of her mother's actions. Lily, for her part, withdrew deeper into herself. The once lively and spirited teenager was now a shadow of who she had been. She no longer spoke much, and when she did, her voice was flat, as if every ounce of joy had been drained from her soul. She avoided her mother as much as possible, retreating to her room for hours on end, only emerging when absolutely necessary. Helen knew her daughter was broken, but there was nothing she could do to fix it. There was no going back from what they had both witnessed. The guilt gnawed at Helen day and night. She was a mother, a protector, and she had failed. She had failed to protect her daughter from a monster she had never imagined could be her father. She had failed to find another way, another solution. The gunshots still echoed in her mind, the sound of each bullet leaving the chamber like a haunting reminder of her inability to stop it. The only comfort, if it could even be called that, was the thought that she had saved her daughter from a far worse fate. But the cost had been enormous. Months passed and the case slowly inched toward its conclusion. The investigation was long and meticulous, with detectives and forensic experts combing through every shred of evidence. They found the usual things: fingerprints, blood stains, and a clear trajectory of the bullets. But what they couldn't find was a clear-cut answer. Was it self-defense? Was it a crime of passion? The details were murky and the law was complicated. The district attorney's office ultimately decided that Helen had acted out of a twisted sense of protection, though they couldn't fully justify the manner in which she had taken her father's life. It was clear that the emotional trauma she had endured played a part in the violent act, but it was also clear that the law couldn't simply ignore the fact that she had killed a man. The case was complicated, and no one could truly say if justice had been served. Helen pled guilty to manslaughter, a conviction that carried a prison sentence. But there was something about the case that the public couldn't quite reconcile. Was she a victim herself? Had she simply snapped, unable to handle the unbearable weight of her father's betrayal? Or was she just another officer who had crossed the line? In the end, the court sentenced Helen to 10 years in prison. It wasn't the life sentence that some had predicted, nor was it the leniency others had hoped for. It was a middle ground, an acknowledgement of both the tragedy and the circumstances that led to it. Helen's fate was sealed and there was no going back. The sentencing was a quiet affair, with the courtroom packed with people who had known Helen for years, and others who had only known her through the media. She stood before the judge, her once proud posture now slumped under the weight of her guilt. She thought of Lily sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her face drawn and pale. The mother and daughter locked eyes, but there was no comfort in the exchange. Only silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. And so, Helen was led away in handcuffs, the weight of the chains around her wrists a bitter reminder of the life she had once known, now gone forever. But that was not the end of the story for neither Helen nor Lily. The years passed slowly in prison for Helen. She found herself alone in a world that no longer made sense, surrounded by women who had committed their own crimes, some of which seemed far less heinous than her own. The constant reminder of her past, of what she had done, was her companion in every moment. But in those years Helen found an unexpected source of solace: time. Time to think, to reflect, to understand the depths of her emotions and her actions. Eventually Helen found herself at peace with what had happened. She would never forgive herself, but she learned to live with it. She wrote to Lily regularly, though the responses were few and far between. She understood why Lily struggled to reach out. Helen couldn't fix what had been broken, but she could try to make amends in the only way she knew how. Lily, too, had changed over the years. She graduated high school and left Rosedale for a new life, one that had nothing to do with her mother or grandfather. She chose to become a social worker, determined to help children who had been victims of abuse, determined to give them a future that she had never had. Lily's healing was slow, but it was steady. She never forgot what had happened, but she learned to live with it in a way that allowed her to move forward. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for, healing however it came. Helen's time in prison wasn't the end of the road, but a chapter in a much longer, far more complex story. She would never be free of her past, but in time she learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about living with it, accepting the consequences, and finding a way to forgive herself, even if the world never would. If you're captivated by the twists and turns of this heartbreaking journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more gripping stories to life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our true crime documentaries.